The whole idea behind the Christ consciousness holds a much more deeper meaning for every single human being. Understanding that the Christ consciousness is indeed a literal, internal, alchemical process that each of us has the capability to experience. Find out more about the Christ oil and the Sacred Secretion in this episode of New Earth Teachings. And so we're going to take much more of a simple view when it comes to understanding the nature of the Christ oil, otherwise referred to as the chrism oil, or the Christos, or of course, the Sacred Secretion. We're not going to look into biblical reference representing the Christ oil in this video. If you look at the video description, I have included a couple of links that do fill in the information pertaining to biblical reference when it comes to the Christ oil. My intention through this episode is to helping you get a basic understanding about what the Christ oil represents, and also being able to follow up with a practical form of practice and methodology that will assist you in working in bringing the Christ oil anointed to you monthly. That's my intention through this video. So the first thing we're going to look at is the simple way, the creation of the Christ oil itself. Now, of course, that's getting into some advanced and sophisticated brain chemistry. But the Vedic tradition relating to the Christ oil, which they would refer to also as the Amrita nectar. Another name, it can also be the idea of soma. Soma juice, soma wine, right? It's the idea of soma fluid, right? That is also another term representing this particular substance. But this oil is produced naturally in the brain. Now, certain researchers will tell you that it starts off in what's known as the area of the claustrum, which you could say is about the central point, the central nexus. If you were to cut the brain in half, it would be like a chimney coming down to where the sacred secretion is produced. But it actually starts off somewhere else. If we're looking back into Indian traditions, it actually moves much more into the area that we would call the bindu. The bindu is basically referred to as the divide. It's a seal, it's a point, and it's located right at the soft palate, just around the area of the fontanelle, the top of the head. And there is an area there that the Vedics have referred to as bindu. In Sanskrit, like I said, it means to divide. That is actually where it takes place. That's where it begins. It's again moving in from the immaterial to the material, because the bindu is the point between material and non-material or spirit, where we would basically have nothing there that we could identify. But the bindu is the bridge, it is the medium, it is the point, it is the divide between the immaterial and material reality. And through the bindu, that is where the journey begins. Then it starts to move in regards to the creation of the secretion, which therefore follows through the claustrum. Okay? And of course we have what's known as the honey and the milk. Of course, like I said, I'm not going to speak too much on biblical reference, because again, other researchers have done a great job with that. But the honey and milk, or the land of milk and honey, are again the natural substances that are produced through the pineal and pituitary glands. Okay, we could look at it in the idea of the pineal being the positive or the masculine, and the pituitary being the negative or the feminine. Or we could look at the solar and the lunar, the pineal and the pituitary. So again, this substance emerging from the bindu, coming down into the claustrum, the chimney, right? That's where we get Santa Claus. The idea of Santa Claus is bringing gifts, bringing presents, right? We could even say presents as P-R-E-S-E-N-C-E, down the chimney, okay? Down the claustrum. And moving into the medulla oblongata, okay? The brain stem. And that this sacred secretion moves all the way down the spine and nesting itself into what is known as the sacral plexus, okay? The sacrum. So we see this triangular-like bone, okay? Right at the bottom here is the coccyx. We have 5 fused bones representing the sacral plexus. We have nerves there that's often referred to as the horse's tail. And so this is where the oil or the substance gathers itself. It moves itself into the sacral plexus, okay? So there's quite a journey that takes place here, starting all the way from bindu, the amrita nectar, the soma juice, the sacred secretion, the Christ oil, the chrism oil, the Christos, okay? Many different terms for it, but it still represents the one thing. We could also, if we're rewinding back here a little bit, we could also look into the history of what many of the yogis have talked about in utilizing a particular form of mudra to actually start to taste the nectar before it actually makes its way down to the sacral plexus. And that is a technique that is referred to as Kachari mudra. Okay? That's where you're taking your tongue and you're able to move it all the way back, right? And moving it upwards into the nasopharynx. And we're actually able to make contact into the area of the pituitary gland so that you could actually taste kind of a bittersweet nectar, right? The milk may be the idea of something somewhat bitter, and the honey, of course, being the sweetness of it. It's a honey, it's a sweet, bittersweet kind of taste when you're tasting the sweet nectar. Now, we're not going to get too much into that, but that again follows ancient Vedic traditions relating to using Kachari mudra to basically taste the Amrita nectar as it's moving itself down the spine. And of course, continues to do this cycle every single month. Okay? So this is giving you an overview that we have this sacred secretion, that it is brought forward through spirit, through the immaterial, through God, through the divine, okay? And it is naturally produced in the brain, goes down the claustrum. It's naturally produced as well too through the pituitary and pineal glands, moving itself down the medulla oblongata, going all the way down the spine until it connects directly to the sacral plexus. And now we're going to go a little bit more into the discussion pertaining to the ascent of the Christ oil. So as I talked about here, we're looking at the Christ oil moving its descent into the area of the sacral plexus, or the horse's tail, that bundle of nerves representing that of the sacral plexus. So at a particular time of the month, the Christ oil starts to move itself upwards. It's moving itself from the sacral plexus. It's going all the way up the spine. Very similar to like what we would understand with Kundalini, where it's able to move up into each energy center or chakra center. Okay, so it's moving up the sacral plexus, and it's moving right into the area of the solar plexus here. Okay, so the solar plexus, this is where that Christ oil in a way becomes a seed or a germ in that way. It basically stations itself in the solar plexus and that oil remains there. It's basically being transfigured. As it becomes transfigured, it then moves its way up through the heart, and then of course finally moving up into the pit of the throat, or the cervical plexus. Okay, so basically the plexi of the body is receiving the Christ oil. Now again, when we're looking at the neck here, or the throat, it basically is intersecting with the vagus nerve. We refer to it as the pneumogastric nerve as well too, like a cross. Okay, and again, if we go back into biblical understanding, that this is the idea of the Christ on the cross being sacrificed, right? The oil being sacrificed and returning itself up into the brain, specifically the optic thalamus, and into the pineal gland. So as it moves into the optic thalamus, as it moves into the pineal gland, this is where a powerful activation takes place after 2.5 days of a journey, starting from the sacral plexus, moving its way up, eventually, after the 2.5 days, to the optic thalamus, into the pineal gland. And through here, this is where we're seeing a cascade of activation taking place inside the brain. The brain allows these particular forms of brain cells to become active, no longer dormant. So we could look at hundreds of thousands to many millions of dormant brain cells becoming active. This again goes back into the biblical prophecy where you would see the face of God, right? I saw the face of God at pineal. Okay? Like I said, I'm not going to go too much into the biblical information about it. But this again represents a divine activation, a divine ascent. We could see it also as being raised to glory, right? The Christ within you being sacrificed and therefore being raised to glory. As it is being raised to glory, it is now able to be one with God. Therefore, the idea of the Christ consciousness is the anointing of being one with God. You have anointed yourself to know God. You have anointed yourself to see God. You have anointed yourself to be one with God. The Father and I are one. This therefore represents the 2.5 day journey, representing the Christ oil, moving itself from the sacral plexus all the way up to the optic thalamus and pineal gland, so that you can have a powerful Christ consciousness awakening to see God, to see the face of God, okay? So when I'm talking about seeing the face of God, I'm not saying that a face of the Almighty is appearing. The face you're seeing is your own. It's to realize that you are God. It is to realize that you are pure consciousness. It is to realize that you are the self. There is nothing out here that is going to say, oh, by the way, this is God. Okay? You have to see yourself as God. It is the realization. It's moving you into that understanding that you are the realized Christ consciousness, that you realize that you are God. It becomes a truly enlightening experience. You move yourself into higher intuition. You move yourself into greater expansion, right? This is what represents heaven. Heaven represents the skull, right? That is truly what we would understand as the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is being revealed to man. And through the activation of the brain, it's opening up your centers, opening up the brain cells so that you can see the expansion. For yours is the kingdom of heaven. This is the nature of the ascent of the Christ oil. And we're going to look a lot more into the practicality in preparing yourself for the Christ oil. Now, there are quite a few experts that talk about the Christ oil and basically give a lot of biblical reference pertaining to what you need to do. Some of those recommendations that are decoded from the Bible will often talk about let go of the 7 deadly sins, right? So we're looking at transcending those, right? Don't be greedy, don't be prideful, right? Don't be a glutton, don't be lustful, don't be wrathful, okay? Don't be greedy, any of these things, right? We look at the 7 deadly sins and we're moving past that. Well, okay, that doesn't really give you too much practical advice in regards to helping yourself in moving yourself into preparation for the Christ oil. Now, as I said, the Christ oil takes 2.5 days. It is when your moon is moving directly into your sun's sign. And that is where the process begins every single month. So in my example, as I am a Pisces in Vedic astrology, my sun being in the 12th house, okay? So every month when the moon moves into Pisces, for me, that is the 2.5 day cycle where you are beginning this process of preparation. So what is the process of preparation that can be tangible, that can be practical, that we can start working with? Well, of course, some will suggest meditation. Some will suggest things like breath control, like pranayama, okay? And that's all great. What I truly recommend is a very simple, practical application to helping you move into that preparedness of letting the Christ oil move all the way up the spine, going all the way into the optic thalamus and into the pineal gland. And one interesting way of doing that is working with the contemplation of platonic solids. But Brad, what does that mean? Well, this is something that I'd recommend you work with Google Images, and that you are Googling the platonic solids. So you're going to see things like a tetrahedron. You're going to see things like a sphere. You're going to see things like a cube. You're going to see an octahedron, an icosahedron, a dodecahedron, and so forth. These are harmonic geometries. Now, in ancient times, Egypt had chambers that filled with these carvings of sacred geometry upon their walls. And one of the ways that they were able to help heal a person is they would take them into these chambers that had these platonic solids carved upon the walls, and that person would remain in the room. After a certain amount of time, that person would be able to leave that room, that chamber, and feel completely restored. The platonic solids are assisting you in harmonizing your magnetic field. The platonic solids are assisting you in healing yourself through all of the discrepancies that are created through us. If we are looking at ourselves, everything that represents our being, we are simply a magnetic field. You see, we could not exist in this universe if we did not have a magnetic field. If there was no magnetism within ourselves whatsoever, we would not be in this physical universe. We would not be here. But what happens is that we contaminate our magnetic field with skewed geometry. That skewed geometry is what precisely makes us sick. It's like taking a beautiful harmonic image and just scribbling all over it and distorting it and skewing it and stretching it and taking it all out of its beautiful geometric pattern. But when we return to that geometric pattern, that harmonic pattern, that is what clears away our ailments. So the key here is to work together with harmonizing your being, utilizing meditation, contemplation of the platonic solids. So if you were able to print out some of those platonic solids that I'm talking about here, the cube, the sphere, the tetrahedron, the icosahedron, the dodecahedron, okay? Just look up platonic solids and grab a hold of those images and start printing them out. You may want to put them in a book. You may want to hang them on your wall. Whatever you decide to do, you're utilizing those platonic solids. As you start to contemplate the nature of those platonic solids. For example, you may stare with open eyes at a sheet of paper that has a tetrahedron in it, or a cube, or a sphere. You may decide to stare at it for several minutes and then close your eyes and just say, okay, recreate that sphere, recreate that cube, recreate that tetrahedron, recreate that icosahedron or dodecahedron. And you're just contemplating the natural, harmonic, platonic solids. And what is going to happen over time is that you're strengthening your magnetic field. You're building an immune system. But you're building an immunity magnetically. This is where the power lies. So as we continue to work with platonic solids daily, it's not so much of just having to do it over those 2.5 days. Rather, it's being able to make a daily effort in contemplating, meditating on the platonic solids and letting that immerse, let that platonic absorption come into you, right? This is what I refer to as platonic absorption. You are absorbing yourself into those platonic solids. You are going to notice that as you do this more and more over time, your body is going to feel amazing. Your traumas, your tendencies are going to start disappearing. They're going to start fading away. Another practice alongside with the platonic solids is simply chanting Om. Just your ability to chant Om, like what I have developed through the prana transmission technique. And you are watching through the power of Om how everything representing distortion, heaviness, trauma, conflict within your life is starting to melt away. Because we are working with purity here. We are working with natural harmonics. We are bringing our own magnetic field back into its harmonic array. Its own harmonic brilliance is being established by you by going into platonic absorption, by doing the Om chant, and also finally learning how to surrender. Surrendering to everything. So, just as I also have created a series called the Release Ball Method on my YouTube channel playlist, and utilizing the Release Ball Method, helping yourself to go into a state of surrender and letting everything go. That if we hold on to these tragedies, that's what's going to cause the Christ oil to burn up. If we are lustfully having sex constantly, and it's very much in a lustful manner, that's going to affect it, because you do want to have some type of preservation there in regards to your natural semen. I'm mostly talking to the men, right? For women too, it's also important that if we're indulging in lustful endeavors, that can also affect the Christ oil, because what you're looking at here is a harmonic resonance. The Christ oil represents a harmonic resonance, and like Kundalini, it moves itself up the spine. The same thing goes if you are doing a Kundalini awakening. If your Kundalini is not in the state of a harmonic balance, you are not going to have a Kundalini awakening. The same thing goes with the Christ oil. It is a harmonic resonance. And we want to make sure that we're appropriating ourselves into harmonic resonance. Every single form within this body, on a cellular level, on the level of our organs, of our glands, of our bodily systems, etc., all resonate with a certain frequency. And when you're going into platonic absorption, what you're doing is you're resetting all of those magnetic fields that represent your cells, your organs, your glands, your bodily systems, and so forth. The organism of this physical body is being appropriated and brought back into a harmony. So these are the three things that I would suggest as you're working in preparation. Not at the last minute, but being able to work on this every single day. Platonic absorption, the Om chant, and surrendering. And if you are able to do this, you will feel the Christ oil moving its way up, raising itself to glory, moving into the optic thalamus and into the pineal gland, and you will feel the awakening. It's not something that you can miss. You feel a euphoric experience when your Christ oil moves itself up into glory. How do I know this? Because I have had the Christ oil moved into me a multitude of times. It's not just a one-shot deal. You have the ability for the Christ oil to awaken you every single month. And it will continue to do so. And this is not only going to bring about great expansion of who you know yourself to truly be, this is also what helps you to extend your life. This can actually help you to live longer. This was the great secret of the ancients, to which they have been handed down this divine knowledge, and they have shared it and protected it through the nature of code. This is the entire story of Christ within the Bible. Not only just talking about him as a man, as the Christ, but also referencing the idea of the Christ oil being a process, an inner alchemy. The Bible is an occult book, and it is a book of inner alchemy. It is a book about the body. It is the book about how man can return to God, right? It's not just the idea of a historical document. It's an occult book. So when you follow it in that way and you understand the codes, this is exactly what it's telling you. Everyone has the Christ seed within them. Everyone can work together with the Amrita nectar. Everyone can work together with the Soma juice or the Soma wine. You can work with the Christos. You can work with the chrism. You can work with the Christ oil, and you can raise yourself to glory. This is what the Christ oil is all about. It is anointing yourself in Christ consciousness so that you know God. That is its entire purpose.